Phoenix Collective. Welcome back to Taboo Talks with Krystal, where we dive into the real, raw conversations that help us heal. I'm Krystal, your host, and I'm so glad you're tuning in today. In this episode, we're talking about releasing shame and using vulnerability to heal from trauma, a journey that can be tough, but life-changing. And I have an incredible guest here to help us unpack this today. Joining us is Corrina, also known as that Ozarks girl. As the real life inspiration behind the character Charlotte from the Netflix series Ozark, she grew up in a family entangled in crime and secrecy. Today, she's a certified trauma and stress coach with training under Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, author of The Body Keeps the Score, and Dr. Scott Barry Kaufman, a leading expert in self-actualization. She's also studied the neuroscience of flow, giving her a unique approach to guiding others in healing intergenerational trauma. Through her coaching and her podcast, My True Crime Life, Corrina helps others break cycles of trauma and unlock their full potential. She's a mom, a new grandmother, and a powerful example of what's possible when we face our past and choose to heal. So if you're ready to shed the shame that's been weighing you down, this episode is for you. Let's welcome Corrina to Taboo Talk.
No, thank
So
you.
good to have you here.
Yeah, it's so great. I feel so excited that you invited me here, and I'm so thankful. And I just feel like there's so many parallels to what we're doing together.
Absolutely. You know, your story is so powerful and inspiring. Can you just start by sharing how growing up in the Ozarks shaped your life and how you went from living in secrecy and trauma to healing and transforming your story?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And thank you for asking it. Um, I'm going to answer that because I think there's kind of two questions there. And I'll start with the first. And that was how growing up in the Ozarks shaped my life. So I think there's a couple of critical things that really made a difference for me and are actually part of my healing story. So the first one is appreciation for safety and calm in nature. So living in Lake of the Ozarks, I had access to a lake, uh, forest, all the nature for miles. And I would just kind of naturally gravitate as a child to the outdoors. And there's a lot of studies that show that uh, the safety and calm that you feel in nature actually has healing power, like scientific healing power. So that was a big one. And you'll hear about me kind of talk about hopefully today in other aspects. The second one that reflects most to me is it was kind of a small town. Even though it's a big place, big tourism, it's a small town. And there were a lot of people that shunned from me as a child because even though a lot of people didn't know everything about my parents that I'm sharing right now and through my podcast, they still knew that they were shady characters. And so a lot of parents told their children they couldn't play with me.
Mm.
But there were a few parents who were, I believe, educated enough, secure enough that I had this very short list of friends growing up that their parents invited me to their home. I spent a lot of time outside of my house if I could, sleep in sleepovers. And that really shaped my self-esteem, helped me see what a normal family felt like and felt love and felt safe. So until this day, those friends from the Ozarks, I can call up and just start where we left off. It's so strong and so significant of what they did for me in a very turbulent time growing up. The other one is my mother's journey. So, our intergenerational trauma is huge. And my mother was this really complicated character who was entrepreneurial. She ran businesses. She came up with all these bright ideas, knew money, knew how to like be successful. And I watched her have this sense of like strong agency. But the other part to that is even in her bold spirit, she was still traumatized and trapped within the family structure that we had.
Mm-hmm.
The last thing was the survival skills. So I think that when we learn the power of our survival skills from our childhood trauma, we often, before we even realize that, we often see it as a curse. But in that same thread, it makes us incredibly sharp and valuable in society. So I see that a lot of people who are, who've had childhood trauma as an adult kind of go into these careers where they're really smart, they're they're great under pressure, and they end up becoming very successful in life. So the survival skills have a real place in leveraging, opportunity. On the flip side of that, they often that ends in self-sabotage. It can that trajectory, there's like this point where we hit self-sabotage because those extreme survival behaviors limit us eventually in our careers and we fall down. But those are the key things. Now, the second part of this question is how you went from living in secrecy to healing and transforming your story. So the truth is, I was very much underwater about all of this until a few years ago. All the issues I was having in my life, depression, anxiety, relationships, job dynamics, financial problems, were consistently an uphill battle for me. I could never win. I had spent decades, and this is the crazy part, I spent decades going to doctors and to psychiatrists and therapists. And the only thing I disclosed in these visits was my history of sexual abuse and physical abuse. I really didn't understand what my childhood was like in the Ozarks and that it was abnormal because in an abused family structure, you're forced to learn that this is normal, carry on.
100%.
And yeah, and so the issue when I would watch the show, things were coming up for me that triggered my trauma memory very clearly. Things were coming like there were just these little things. And it wasn't just, oh, this show is filmed in my hometown. And that's why it's familiar to me. It was very clear and crisp to me that the scenarios of certain aspects of the show were familiar deeply as I had experienced them. And so I started to, it was about 2017, I started to ask my mom, and my mom had never seen the show until this day, has not seen Ozarks. And I was asking her questions like, can you tell me about this? Because I knew in my head I was trying to fact check if I was really seeing what I was seeing. And she started to tell the story. For example, there was a story of where we almost ended up being foster children because the DEA and some agents had planned to plant drugs on my family because they couldn't catch them. And it's a long story, but there's a part in Ozarks where they plant drugs to manipulate the investigation. And there's also this piece where it's like there was my family car was in there, and it's a very unique car. It's not something you throw in a 2000 show. So even at that time when I was matching these stories, my kids were teenagers. And I was so busy with career, so dissociated just by my own trauma, depression, anxiety challenges that I
Mm-hmm.
had zero space to process or even act on and think that this was my problem. And so once once my kids became older, which I have a 25 and 23-year-old now, and they've moved out. Um, about the time that they were empty, I was an empty nester, I started to have this mental space. And when I had that mental space, I started to realize, oh, holy cow, this is not something small. This is abnormal. And this is really the foundation of my story that's being played out on screen. And then the more I dug and we fast forward today, it's interesting because it's not even just about the Ozarks. So, my family, which I'll tell in my podcast that I have, is my family was actually had mob ties in the Las Vegas skimming that you saw in the scenario in the movie Casino with Robert De Niro. And
Mm-hmm.
so, like, there's this trail of what happened in Las Vegas and the mob to my parents going to the Ozarks. And I think that, you know, that became the moment, like, after my children left, that I could actually process this and bring it to surface and have the mental capacity to work through it.
Yeah. Wow. I can't imagine watching a show and realizing that it was depicting my life and thinking that that was completely normal and realizing, wait a minute. this isn't this isn't quite how everyone else lives.
Right. Well, and then you're sitting in a car. Like I remember my mom came to watch my kids when I was going to get ready to go on a vacation, so I
Hmm.
could go out. She was watching them, and they were in high school, and I was like, she was telling me the story while we were sitting in the car before we walked into the house to the kids, and I just remember going, "Holy cow!" Like this is she's telling the story that I'm seeing on screen. This is insane.
Twilight Zone. Oh my
Yes.
gosh.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. So, what made you decide to start opening up and sharing your story?
So this is what made me decide to so this is there's actually a couple things to this. um Sorry, I'm pausing here for a second because I'm trying to figure out how I want to answer this, because there's a couple portions to it, so I'll start here. So I'm going to tell you how I got here, and I think it's really a pivotal point that I think your listeners will appreciate and glean some you know highlights from. So the in 2016, so before even Ozarks came out, I read this book called Stealing Fire by Stephen Kotler.
Hmm.
The book is not about trauma, but what he was talking about was the power of flow and being in the flow and being a high performer. And in that book, what I took out of it was this power of meditation and how to live your fullest potential. So I actually started meditating at that point. Because I actually didn't think I could do it because my mind was so busy with the symptomatic things that happen with trauma. But
Hmm.
I started meditating. That was a real eye opener to even realizing that I was in the wrong marriage and that it was a trauma bond. But then fast forward to 2021, I was divorced. I was really spiraling out of control. I had addictions that were that I was drowning in. I couldn't wake up in the morning, couldn't get out of bed. I had people calling me, like the very short two friends I had in life calling me in the morning to get me out of bed, and for either because I had such dark thoughts I was afraid I wasn't going to let myself wake up, or I just couldn't get out of bed because I couldn't, I would stay up all night and then I have to sleep all day. So in 2021, COVID around COVID time, this thing comes across my screen to this idea of this course called Zero to Dangerous, the Neuroscience of Flow, founded by Stephen Kotler. I had very little money. I had very little options. I was literally, I had no idea what to do with myself anymore. I was so sick of myself. And I said, I know him. I went to the sales call and I listened to them and I was like, I'm going to sign up for this. I couldn't even really afford it. Like I was shoestringing the money to do it. And what that opened up is a whole universe that put this Ozarks experience and who I was and why I struggled in life so much. It allowed me to understand neuroscience and how the brain works. And which the first part of the program, I was paired with a PhD coach. His name was Dr. Nick Holton. He runs the Flourishing podcast. Highly recommend that for anybody who's looking to live a better life. But he was my coach. He's a former sports coach for professional sports and psychologist. And I gave him my sort of download of my addictions, and I was sick of myself and I wanted to take this course to figure out how to be a better human.
Right.
And he said, we talked about my love for nature. He said, you need to just get back out in nature. And it was so simple. Like we spent the whole hour. That's the one thing I remember. And at this point, like I was drinking 600 milligrams of caffeine just to stay up. I was depressed. I was on Adderall, all this. So I said, okay, I'll do what you say because I got nothing else. I was like, I don't think it's going to work, but whatever. So every day I was working remote at the time. I would go out and I would, even if I only had 20 minutes, I would make myself go outdoors and hike or go somewhere where I could experience nature. And what happened, the magic that happened, is I was finally in my place of calm and safety. And when I got into my calm and safety, my executive functioning started to work. And I started to be able to organize my thoughts very clearly and realize and think through what I was doing to myself, what was going on, and put all the pieces together. Now, the second part of this is that I eventually signed up for a second course, and that was to become a flow coach. So actually coach these things that I was learning. And we had to do a thesis. That thesis, when I was sitting in the course with all my other colleagues for the course, I started to see a pattern. I was like, some of these people are feeling the same thing I'm feeling. What do you want to bet that they have childhood trauma? And so my thesis became this pivot around calm, safety, and enabling flow, which led me to understanding adverse childhood experiences. And once I opened the door on adverse childhood experiences and the research and the risks associated with adverse childhood experiences, I was pissed. Sorry, can I say that?
Yeah, 100%. You can say whatever on this podcast.
I was so angry because I was like, oh my gosh, the CDC actually has reports on it, but there's so much more to it. But it was this study done by Dr. Folletti. He originally had started doing this Kaiser Permanente study on obesity, and he saw this very common thread, and he had a hypothesis that adverse childhood experiences, so which, to be clear, adverse childhood experiences are a lot of things. It's not just about physical abuse. It's not just about sexual abuse. It can be emotional neglect, physical neglect, so not having enough food to eat, etc. It can be parental separation or divorce, household substance abuse. By the way, I have almost all these.
I remember when I first went through that, I was like, well, that's everybody's got this. I can very much relate. It's all of those things.
It is all those things. Right. And I realized that one of the interesting facts about that study, so one, it was 17,000 participants. There's actually a funny story. Let me share this. So much of science, like who decides what we study in science, almost keeps us from understanding what's going on with us, because somebody else is choosing what they study and how they study it and how they actually get it out there. But if you have 4 or more ACEs, there's a high correlation that you are 3.7 times more likely to have anxiety in adult life and 4.5 times more likely to have chronic depression. Now, here's the interesting thing. There's a guy named Dr. Mark Hauser who he was on the psychology podcast with Dr. Kaufman, who I also studied with. And he's made his second life focused on what is the modern day view of adverse childhood experiences. And the whole thing is that once I learned all of this information, I'll get back to Dr. Hauser for a second. I have to say this. Once I learned about all this, I was like, oh my gosh, I know, the people in my class, the people I'm surrounded by, we're not giving enough credit to understanding this to fix ourselves. This is the domino effect of why so many of us are struggling, and what the issues we're seeing in our children and the issues we're seeing in adults. So I was very impassioned at this point. I was pissed that I didn't know this. I was pissed that my doctors missed it for 20 years. And I wanted to be an advocate in the light of my own personal story. So going back to Dr. Mark Hauser, this is so juicy. I have to share this because I just listened to this podcast last month and it was so good. Now, Dr. Hauser talks about, he has a story about a circuit court judge who was sexually abused as a child, and she was very successful. Obviously, she became a circuit court judge. In the light of the world, you would say, oh, she's resilient and she's resolved her problem. She's actually sitting on a lot of, she actually was diagnosed with multiple cancers.
Mm.
Now, if she took the ACE study original survey, there would be only, she would only score a 1. But if you looked at her life, she was excessively and repeatedly sexually abused as a child. So, what Dr. Mark Hauser has transformed to think about in adverse childhood experiences in that survey is that it's actually this concept of the 5 T's. So, that original survey with Dr. Folletti was intended just for the study and just a way to capture the data. And we've sort of just adopted it and kept it. But what he's saying now is that no, there's a better framework for understanding this and how children respond to trauma. And that is its type. So the type of trauma, such as poverty, sexual abuse, or loss of a caregiver, it's the tenure. How long was the child exposed to the trauma? And then timing. When the trauma occurred, at what point does the trauma occur during the child's development? Because each developmental stage introduces a different type of risk to the way your brain is formed.
Mm-hmm.
Then there's the timing. So, well, sorry, no, the toxicity is the severity of the trauma. So, how severe was it? Were you pimped out by your parent for crack? Like, I mean, these are all. I mean, I'm not joking when I say that. Like, there are different severities of how this trauma occurs. And then there's the turbulence. So, how unpredictable and uncontrollable it was. So, if you think about
Mm-hmm.
if you're a small child and it's unpredicted that this would happen and you had no control, that has an impact. So, there's really this whole concept of transforming not just that original, how many did you get on the test, but actually these five aspects really play a part. And so, getting back to your original question, I just, through this journey with the Flow Research Collective, it empowered me and educated me and built my curiosity. And once I started playing detective, it all came to, I have to yell on the rooftops about this because this is so underrated and underlooked in what we're dealing with today in adults with depression, anxiety, ADHD.
Oh my gosh. That's so interesting and resonates with me so much because I feel like I kind of went on the same journey for a bit and then I was hit with more trauma. Um, but I can totally relate to everything. I remember in college, the psychology classes and the things around mental health, those would suck me in so much, and like the science behind it, and yoga. That's a big reason I got into yoga is because of the neuroscience and the trauma being stuck in your body. And um, what's the book? I know you read it. You're based off of.
The Body Keeps the Score
Thank you. Yes.
by Bessel. Yeah.
Yes. All of that, all of that resonates so much, and it's so important to bring attention to it and to recognize how our experiences as children are affecting us today and how then our actions are going to be affecting the next generation. And so the more we can heal and learn and educate ourselves, the better for all, I feel.
Yeah. And Krystal, I just have to tell you, you know, there's like, if I could just reflect on you and celebrate you for a minute, there are so many parents that were in your situation and are not empowered to make the choices that you made. So I'm a result of that. My mom knew, but she was lied to about how it happened. It was an accident. Oh no, it was multiple accidents. And she was so scared that she had nowhere to go. She was with a narcissist, obviously, and told her she had nothing if she left. She was afraid we were going to be foster children. Like, so I just applaud your bravery and strength in the journey you took, because decades ago, I think women would have never been as empowered as you. And I think that's incredible.
100%, 100%. And I can relate so much with all of your mom's feelings. They resonate, they hit deep. Um, and yes, I, that is the whole reason I'm doing what I'm doing, and I do what I do, because I feel it is so important for us to be able to speak up, whether it's for ourselves, for our children, for a neighbor, whoever it needs to be. So thank you
And
for that.
you're welcome. And can I share something else here
100%.
that you said is like, this is your whole reason. This is what you do, and why I do what I do. One of the fascinating things that happens, I think, with trauma is we've been really skilled at living these double lives,
Mm.
and what motivates us, and like what should motivate us, what should be important. And I think one of the biggest breakthroughs for me, and you might be able to relate to, is that when I started connecting to my authentic values, what set my heart on fire, it opened up a whole new world for me to live as the whole person I was, versus continuing to try to live this split personality of somebody who had trauma. But yes, I have to move on, and I have to present to the world to be this person, and I have to do
Uh-huh.
this job.
Yes. Oh,
It's very free,
yes.
very freeing to the body.
It is. To the body, to the mind, to the soul, to everything.
Yeah.
100%.
Yeah.
Corrina, you are here today to help debunk some myths. So I want to ask you, what is the biggest myth around healing from intergenerational trauma that you would like to set straight?
Okay. So this is a good question. And I'm so thankful that you're asking it. And I know it ties to your whole concept of the podcast. So I love it. One of the things that you'll hear drippings of, I think, in the trauma circles in society is some people don't love therapy. Or they say therapy doesn't work for me. Or I see a psychiatrist, but I don't have a therapist.
Guilty,
And
guilty, guilty.
yeah, see? And so guilty, same. And the thing is like, if you trace back my history from my 20s to now, I was a constant, I got to get in therapy, and then I would drop out, and then I would just take the
Hmm.
medication. And what I found, so kind of going back to that journey I had about reconnecting with nature and getting calm, and so I spent 8 months certifying in traumatic stress studies with Bessel van der Kolk, who wrote The Body Keeps the Score. I got to sit in the same Zoom room with him. It was so
Oh,
amazing. Yeah.
incredible.
Yeah, so incredible. Like, experience I will never forget, and has changed my life. But um when I spent 8 months doing that, he had like 30 psychologists and psychiatrists that also taught his lectures as part of that course. And the first thing I learned is the hardest part about therapy with trauma patients is actually making the therapy successful and repeatable. Because when we go into traditional therapy, what happens is we immediately are starting to be asked about our history, what our traumas were, and our body is like, the alarms are on fire. We are just having to relive that trauma through telling it simply to our therapist. And our body just does not react well to it. It just basically almost worsens the experience. And there's this whole connection to dopamine reward system that happens in traumatized brains. That is a whole nother probably hour episode. But that experience, basically squashes that dopamine reward system in going back to therapy, and even under medication. And so what I found is, and I had tried all these different modalities, and what I learned through that course and what I learned through myself is that going to therapy, you have to have a strategy. Like, yes, I don't believe therapy can work if you go into the traditional sense and you're like, let's talk about all your traumas and traumatize you. What will work is if you have a strategy to feel supported by family and friends, or even not even friend, somebody who is really in your court to keep pushing you and supporting you and loving you. And the other piece is being calm and safe so that you have the ability to sit in there and work on the things that matter. Now, how do you do that? The modalities that, one modality that I believe is key. And there's a whole other different types of strategies. You could go into nature like me for like 6 months and then be ready. But EMDR is a really interesting strategy because the whole point of EMDR is that what it's doing is it's shutting off the alarm system and allowing your brain to open up the pathways to that executive functioning, to talk about the trauma in a way that is matter of fact and not traumatizing. So I think therapy is great, but when you make your plan for therapy, you have to come in with a plan of how you're going to feel calm and safe to consistently go there and feel rewarded and have the conversations.
Oh my goodness, that's so important. I was just discussing this with a friend recently. And she's like, I don't feel like I'm getting anything out of therapy. And I said the same thing. I was like, well, what's the plan? What's the goal? What's the strategy? And she's just like, oh, we just talk about how my week was. And I was like, well, you're never going to get anywhere. And if she doesn't have one, she's not going to put one into place. Find another one. Find another one. Find another one.
Oh my
Because
gosh. Yes.
you have to find the person who's going to work with you to help you. Otherwise, you're literally not getting anything out of it.
You brought up another good point that I actually didn't talk about and I love, and that is the therapist. So I've got a superstar list of all these wonderful therapists that I went to, and they're great. But the therapist I ultimately connected with and loved, and she's my therapist today, and I swear she's like my secret sauce. She's a former meth addict that turned into becoming a therapist. She understands trauma and addiction. And I think that her methods, it took me a while to get to figuring out finding the right person. So when I finally was calm enough to go back to therapy, I went through 3 or 4 therapists before I got to her. And it was hilarious to me because I would get into these this first time sessions with some of these therapists and they would be like, I suspect you have bipolar, but they didn't know shit about me, Krystal.
I was diagnosed as bipolar. And I was like, all right, sounds good. Is that going to make everything go away now? It didn't. The drugs just made me sick.
Exactly. And I was just like, but at that point, that was, where I had all the knowledge behind me. And I could call bullshit on it. I could say, no,
Good for you.
you're not doing your job. Next. I remember, and then they wanted me as the treatment plan to go to a psychiatrist. So I have a whole story of where I transitioned off SRIs and Adderall. But the psychiatrist was like, I'm feeling these things. And they're like, oh, great. I think, and they're pulling from their cabinet, you should be on this and this and this. And I was like, no, how about as a psychiatrist, we leverage the conversation about how to use my neuroplasticity and other ways to enable the response my mind needs to have neurologically. And they said, well, that's not what I'm paid to do. That's not what the insurance companies pay me to do. And I
Oh my gosh.
yeah. And what was interesting is in that argument, I ended up with a genetic test. And I talked about that in episode 2 that just went out today. But I took a genetic test. And what really was eye-opening is when that was her last thing to say, well, take a genetic test. Maybe you just had a bad experience with SSRIs. So I said, yeah, this is entertaining. Let's do that. And I'm glad I did because I think 17 out of the 20 SSRIs that are available were not meant for were not a good match for my genetics, and actually could push suicidal thoughts and worsen my depression. And which is why I was struggling to get out of bed for so long
Yep.
before all this came. So I think it's really important to, one, educate yourself, two, then be the boss of yourself and challenge the professionals that are in front of you with that education, and never give up on just finding the right person. Because I think once I got to therapy in a steady state, in a thoughtful state, in a calm state, I was like, oh, this is amazing. Like, I'm learning so many cool tricks now, and I'm like so much wiser and such a better adult out of this experience. And I would have never said that in the 20 years before that. Of all the people that I saw, it was never successful.
Yes. Yes. Oh my goodness. We could probably have a whole episode just on therapy itself. So
Right.
I'm gonna I'm gonna leave it at that, and just
Okay.
with the final thought that, medication is important, therapy is important, but nothing is going to work in and of itself. Like you said, you need support. If you don't have a full tribe, a lot of us didn't or don't, build one. Like you said, all you need is one or two people in your corner. And yeah, I love that. Thank you. Before you
Thank
leave,
you.
I have one more question for you. What
Hmm.
would you say is your greatest failure along this journey? And how did it shape the way you approach your healing and your coaching today?
Oh gosh, that's such a tough question. So, what was my greatest failure along the journey, and how did it shape the way I approach your healing coaching today?
Or what did you learn? What was your greatest failure and what did it teach you?
So, yeah, I think that's why I'm struggling, is because the one core belief I have till this, like, in my transformed state, I don't I no longer resent or regret what happened to me in the past. I believe that it shaped me to be a valuable person in this world and to contribute and help others.
Mhm.
That's post traumatic growth for me. And so I would never ask for a redo, because the redos, I'm sure, have some similar challenge, right? We're all meant to be on this earth to be challenged and grow and learn. So I think my greatest learning was, I think that I my greatest learning was the people I picked to have in my life.
So
And
powerful.
right? Because the people you pick in your life and surround you will have an influence and a force on you of how you navigate towards healing. And I have two beautiful grown children. They are everything to me. And I talk to them every day about intergenerational trauma. I'm also a grandmother. I have a granddaughter.
So, so sweet.
She's adorable.
Congratulations.
Thank you. And what I, what, in the marriages that I had, and there were marriages,
Mm.
is I kept trauma bonding. And those marriages would actually got in the way of my support and healing, because they were narcissistic, some level of neglect. I'm not gonna say other words, because I don't want those people to
Yeah,
hear it. I want to be respectful, but
right.
it did not. And now I removed the people that did not support my healing, did not honor and let me process and be the person I am. I have this amazing, wonderful partner who, even in I had a relapse in my addiction last year, still stood behind me and was like, no, I believe in you. This is just something you're working through. This is not who you really are. And without those types of support people in my life, you know, you fall to the ground. You're abandoned.
Corrina, thank you so much for sharing your heart and your journey with us today. Your story is just a beautiful reminder that there is so much power in being vulnerable, and that by opening up and shedding our shame, we're not only healing ourselves, but like we said, we begin to break the cycles that can hurt future generations. Mamas, if you're listening and you're feeling weighed down by shame or trapped in silence, I want you to know that you're not alone and you don't have to carry that weight anymore. Sharing your story is the first step toward healing. And as Corrina has shown us, vulnerability can be your greatest strength. Corrina, you mentioned a couple of times, I know you've just released something very special. It digs even deeper into your story and these topics. Could you share just a bit about My True Crime Life podcast and how listeners can tune in?
Yes, thank you so much. This was a big deal for me. It took 4 years to get this out. I always wanted something like this. So, my true crime life is I weave in the historical intergenerational trauma that replicates the movie Casino and Ozark story that I experienced through my entire childhood. But it also weaves in the science and a relatable, digestible way of understanding trauma. And so my hope is through this vulnerability of sharing this story that others can be curious and start their own journey. And you can go to mytruecrimelife.com/mytruecrimelife and listen to that podcast. It's also available on Spotify and Apple. And thank you so much for allowing me to share that. And I hope that between the two of us and many others, we're a superpower to change the world and change and heal intergenerational trauma.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you so much again for being here.
Thank you, Krystal.
Mamas, be sure to tune in to My True Crime Life. It is a powerful, real look into how trauma can shape us, and even more importantly, how we can overcome it. And if today's conversation resonated with you, don't forget to check out my Mom Stress SOS workshop. It's filled with practical tools to help you stay grounded and emotionally strong, even when life feels overwhelming. You'll find the link in the show notes, along with the link to Corrina's podcast. And that's it. That's all we have for today. Remember, ladies, you are stronger than you think. You are never alone. And you're doing the work not just for yourself, but for your kids too. Keep breaking those cycles. Keep showing up for yourself. And I'll see you back here next week. Take care.